Okay, well, we're all ready to go again. This lesson, I don't think is really going to take that long. This particular Bible study for this session, I wanted to talk about the three heavens. And Mormonism has always taught that there are three heavens. And when I started reading, probably the biggest difference is I had to know if the translations were correct. And so one of the biggest things that I wanted to study was to study in the original languages. And so when I got to the Greek of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, there was a lot of things that I realized that, when they made the translation of King James, somebody was being very colorful or poetic in their translation, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that the words that were used to translate into celestial and terrestrial in the King James Version of the Bible were translated from the words, well, the first one, epirounia, is the Greek word, or epirania, I guess is how it might be pronounced, epirania, means heavenly. In any other place in the New Testament, it would be translated as heaven, okay, or heavenly. And so it means heaven. So we're talking about heavenly bodies, and then when it's had the word terrestrial, when you look at the word for that, is the word for that was translated into terrestrial, which is epagaia, which means earth or earthly. So we're talking about this earth, bodies from this earth, and bodies from heaven. And that's the same wording as all throughout the entire passages that is in here. He's talking about epagaia and epironia, meaning heavenly and earthly. And, of course, for the guy who was translating in, I'm sure that he had heard heaven and earth so many times. He was bored, and he decided to go with, well, what other word could I use that means the same thing? Celestial. Well, celestial means the same as heaven. And what other words could I use besides earth? Because that's just so boring. We'll use terrestrial. And so celestial, terrestrial, they go together. It's nice place settings, that sort of thing. And so, that's what he went with. But it totally changed my whole entire understanding of the passage when those two words were changed to mean something else. Where we're talking about bodies from this earth and resurrected bodies that are from heaven, it totally changes the whole meaning. And then he also talks about animals, and animals we see here on earth, and they are very different from that of those in heaven, and so very different perspective. And then he tries to describe it as the difference between the brightness of the sun versus the brightness of the moon or the brightness of the stars, because our bodies here have certain capabilities, but certainly our heavenly bodies will have more capabilities than here. And so he's just trying to give us some a perspective. But it's certainly not talking about three heavens in the sense of, okay, these are what these different heavens are going to be like, because he's certainly talking about things here on earth. And so when you read that passage in the Greek, it totally has a different meaning and totally changed everything else. And the only other verses that Mormons will turn to is, well, I was caught up into the third heaven. Peter talks about that, or Paul talked about that. And so that caused me to do a lot more study and research in the Bible, because the Bible actually has three different heavens that it references, and they all are called heaven, but they all have different meanings. The first heaven, and you can find this, is the atmosphere, or the where the birds are. Here's a good example. In Genesis 2:19, the fowls of heaven, meaning the birds of heaven. And another example from Lamentations, the eagles of heaven, Lamentations 4:19, are a couple really good examples of talking about the sky that the birds are flying in, or heaven. Okay, we have a different word for it, sky today. But Psalm 78, this is verse 23 says, "Yet he had commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven, and he rained down manna on them to eat, and given them of the bread of heaven." So that puts a different perspective on me, because he's talking about clouds raining down on the earth, and they're raining down from heaven, and that's where the manna came from. So manna actually didn't come from the heaven where God resides, but manna came from here on the earth. And so that kind of makes me, what were the angels doing? Were they taking a whole bunch of flour and putting it in with the clouds that were raining on them, so that when it rained bread? I mean, that's just kind of a weird thing. I don't know. Maybe it was changing some of the clouds to be flour, or I don't know. But very interesting perspective about manna. Which, by the way, manna, if you don't know this, literally means "what is it?" That's the Hebrew. It sounds like manna because it's "what is it?" They didn't understand what it was. And then in Genesis 7, when the flood came, verses 11 through 12, the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And Genesis 8:2, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So obviously it's talking about clouds and rain, and that's one heaven. Okay. Here's another example of this in Deuteronomy 11:17. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce. So we're talking about the sky where the clouds are at. And then Deuteronomy 28:12, the Lord will open the heavens, the storehouse of his bounty, and send on your land rain in season to bless the work of your hands. So again, heavens or the clouds are where rain comes from. Then there's another heaven, which is the starry heavens, okay, where the stars and the sun and that sort of thing are placed. And here's a good example. This is Genesis 1:14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night." Okay, and so that was the firmament of the heaven. Okay, and Psalm 19. Verses 4 and 6, "In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. They will be," and then in Jeremiah 8:2, "they will be exposed to the sun and the moon and all the stars of heaven, which they have of the heavens, which they have loved and served." Talking about people who are astrologers. But the moon and the sun and the stars, so that's another heaven. So you have the heavens where rain comes from, and then the heaven where the sun and the moon and the stars are at. And then there's a third heaven where God is enthroned in heaven. And this is Psalm 2:4. "The one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord scoffs at them." Let's see here. It again in Hebrews 8:1, as our high priest, he is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Often this is the heaven where God is at is called the heaven of heavens. That's in Deuteronomy 10:14 and 1 Kings 8:27. 1 Kings 8:27, this is what it says: "The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain thee," or you. And so this is talking about God and where he lives at, enthroned in the heavens. Certainly we have not found any thrones of God in the clouds where the rain comes from, and certainly we haven't found the throne of God where the sun, the moon, and the stars are at. And so the place where God is much greater or higher than that. And so that's the third heaven. That's the place where God would reside at, and very different than what has been taught here. But when you go back, you look at 1 Corinthians 15, because he's talking about this heavenly body and this earthly body. In verse 42, this is what it is: sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and afterwards the spiritual. The first man was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is of the Lord from heaven. Okay? And so this, he's certainly talking about heavenly bodies and earthly bodies in 1 Corinthians 15. There is only one heaven. It's the place where God resides, where we will go to when we die. There are the two other heavens, but those will not be places where anyone resides as a place to go to after we die. We aren't going to the stars, and we aren't going to the sun or the moon. We're not going to the clouds where it rains. We're going to heaven where God is at. And so a much different perspective. I told you this one was going to be short. I think really the best way to wind this one down is that this is about going to original languages and looking at them. Because when you look at the original Greek and the Hebrew, you can't see anything other than what was intended to be said. Very different perspective, changed everything, and so I would challenge, if you have a question, because I'm certain there are things that we're going to be talking about over time that you're going to have questions about that we aren't going to be studying. I just want to kind of tackle some of the heavy ones, or the ones that were more meaty when I was first coming out. And so thank you for this time. Next lesson, we're going to be actually tackling a little bit about the priesthood and what that is. That one may take a little bit longer because I have some longer passages that I want to read. And then after the priesthood, I'm planning to tackle the concept of marriage from the Bible, whether it lasts for eternity or not, and whether that even matters. Because if I and my wife both are forgiven and we end up in heaven, we will be with each other together forever. Question is, what does that mean? And we'll look at that when we start talking about heaven. So thank you. It's talking about marriage. So thank you for listening, and we'll do this again.